Tonight is about 2 boards, 2 closed rooms, and what happened after people believed the answers. One board told 4 jurors how to vote in a double murder trial. Another was snapped in half before a school full of girls started losing control of their legs. If these cases stay with you, leave a like, subscribe, and comment down below how was your day. Vale is opening both doors now. "500 girls at a Catholic boarding school started walking wrong after one girl used a board after lights out." There is a town south of Mexico City called Chalco, and I want you to understand something about Chalco before I tell you what happened there. It is not a place that makes the news. It is not a place with a famous cathedral or a plaza that appears on travel itineraries. It is a municipality that grew because Mexico City grew, sprawl pushing outward, concrete following concrete, the capital exhaling, and Chalco being part of that breath. Working families, traffic, the kind of ordinary that accumulates slowly, the way sediment accumulates, until the ordinary is all there is. There is a school there, a Catholic boarding school for girls. Some sources call it Girls' Town, some call it Ciudad de las Niñas. The name has a warmth to it, a softness, the city of girls, that makes you think of something bright and clean and hopeful. And maybe it was, in the way that institutions dedicated to structure and prayer and the education of young women often carry a kind of imposed brightness. White walls, a courtyard, dormitories arranged by grade, crucifixes, a chapel. A schedule that told you when to wake, when to eat, when to study, when to pray, when to sleep. I first came across this case in a document that listed it under the clinical heading of mass psychogenic illness. And I read through the details the way you read anything clinical, at a distance, filing information, categorizing. And then I hit the number. 500 girls. 500 girls who could not walk. And I put down what I was reading, and I sat with that for a while, because some numbers stop you, and that one stopped me. Let me tell you about the school before I tell you about Maria, because you need to feel the shape of the place to understand what happened inside it. A boarding school for girls in a Catholic tradition is a specific kind of world. I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean that it is a closed system with its own gravity. You live there, you sleep there, you dream there. You eat every meal in the same dining hall with the same girls at the same tables. You study in the same classrooms, sit in the same chapel, walk the same corridors. The girls who attend such a school do not simply attend it the way a day student attends a school, they inhabit it. The school is their entire environment from Sunday night to Friday afternoon, or in some cases, from the beginning of term to the end. Their world is bounded by those walls. There is something specific about that kind of containment. I am not saying it is bad. I am saying it creates conditions. It creates a density of shared experience that day schools do not have. Every argument, every friendship, every hierarchy, every rumour, every fear. It all exists in a space that closes at lights out and opens again at breakfast. There is nowhere to go. Whatever is moving through that space stays in that space. The school at Chalco had approximately 500 girls enrolled. They ranged in age from perhaps 12 to 17, 18 at the oldest. Young women in that suspended state between childhood and adulthood, learning to become something in a place that had very specific ideas about what that something should look like. Devout, disciplined, controlled. Lights out was a rule, not a suggestion, a rule. And rules at a Catholic boarding school for girls in Chalco, Mexico, in 2006 were enforced. Maria. I want to be careful here because Maria is not a villain in this story. I want to say that plainly before I say anything else about her. She was a teenager. She was curious. She was, by most accounts, not a particularly troubled or frightening person. She was just a girl who had gotten hold of something she probably should not have had, and who used it in a way that violated the rules of the place she lived in, and whose punishment was swift and absolute. I do not know where Maria got the board. Ouija boards were not difficult to obtain in 2006. They were sold in toy stores, in novelty shops. The particular one she had, I do not know if it was store-bought or handmade, or something she had carried with her from home. I do not know if she believed in it, truly believed, or if she was doing what teenagers do in the dark when the rules have been switched off and something feels possible that does not feel possible in daylight. I do not know if she was scared or excited, or simply bored and reaching for something that made the night feel different. What I know is that she was in her dormitory after lights out in October of 2006, and she had the board out, and she was using it. Whether she was alone or with other girls, the accounts differ. Some say she was alone. Some say there were 2 or 3 girls gathered around it with her, their fingers on the planchette, the darkness pressing in from the edges of the room. And a teacher found her. I think about that moment, the door opening, the sudden intrusion of authority into whatever that room had become in the dark. The teacher standing in the doorway with the hall light behind her, looking at what she was looking at. Maria. The board. Whatever else was in that room that night. The teacher took the board. She did not simply confiscate it and put it in a drawer somewhere. She snapped it in half. 2 pieces. Whatever it was, wood or cardboard or something else, she broke it. And maybe there was something satisfying about that to her. Some sense of physical decisiveness about the act. This thing is broken. This thing is ended. And then she reported what she had found, and the school's administration moved with the speed that institutions move when they have been embarrassed by a rule violation. Maria was suspended. Maria was expelled. I want you to hold that in your mind for a moment. She was not just sent home for the week, she was expelled. A Catholic boarding school expulsion is not a small thing. It is a door closing permanently. It is being separated from the only environment you have known for however long you have lived inside it. It is shame, in a community where shame travels. It is your family receiving the news. It is whatever that conversation looks like, whatever your mother's face looks like, whatever your father says or doesn't say. Maria gathered her things and she left the school. And as she left, as she walked out through the gates or down the path, or however the geography of departure worked at that school, she said something. She cursed her classmates. Not metaphorically, not the way you might say, I curse you in frustration, meaning simply, I am angry at you. She said words. She directed something at the girls she was leaving behind. I do not know the exact words. The accounts that have reached me do not include the exact words. But I know that she said them, and I know that the girls who were there heard them, and I know that the girls who were there told other girls what Maria had said, and I know that within weeks, the school at Chalco had a different texture to it than it had before. The first girl who couldn't walk right, I don't know her name. I have searched for it in the records and the accounts that filtered through local Mexican press, and eventually into the clinical literature on mass psychogenic illness, and I cannot find it. So I will call her by what she was. The first. The first noticed it, I imagine, the way you notice something wrong with your body that you can't quite locate yet. A sense of wrongness before you understand where the wrongness is. Maybe she stood up from a chair and something didn't work the way it should have. Maybe she was walking down a corridor and her leg gave way slightly. A buckle, a stumble, something she could attribute to tiredness, or a bad night's sleep, or the unevenness of a floor. Maybe she told herself it was nothing, but it happened again, and again. The specific symptom that would come to define this illness, and I use that word carefully, illness, because what it was has been contested and analysed and clinically categorised in ways I will get to, was gait disturbance, walking wrong, the legs not cooperating, one foot dragging behind its owner, the hip locking, the knee buckling, the rhythm of ordinary movement disrupted in ways that were visible and unmistakable. Girls who had walked normally every day of their lives suddenly could not walk normally. There is something particularly cruel about this symptom. The legs are how you move through the world. They are how you escape. They are what you use to run. If something is wrong with your legs, you are held in place. you are stuck. And for a girl at a boarding school, at a closed institution where the world already ended at the perimeter wall, to lose your legs is to lose the only mobility you had. October passed. November came. The first girl could not walk right, and then a second girl had the same symptom, and then a third. The school administration noticed. The teachers noticed. The girls noticed each other, and when girls notice something spreading among them in a closed space, the information travels faster than anything clinical can track. By December, there were dozens. Not 2, not 5, dozens of girls displaying the same disturbance, the same dragging foot, the same buckling knee, the same inability to walk in the ordinary way that every one of them had walked since they were toddlers. I have read clinical accounts of mass psychogenic illness that describe it in language designed to create distance: conversion disorder, functional neurological disorder, somatoform presentations. The language is precise and careful, and it keeps you at a remove from the thing it is describing. But the thing it is describing is a girl in a school hallway who cannot make her legs work right, who has no disease, no tumour, no lesion, no nerve damage, whose body is simply refusing to do what she is telling it to do, because the environment she is living in has told her body something that overrides everything else. The mind can do this. This is documented. This is not fringe. Mass psychogenic illness has caused blindness, paralysis, uncontrollable laughter, tremors, seizures, symptoms that appear organically, spread socially, and resolve when the social context resolves. The body is not separate from what the mind believes. They are the same system, and what a group mind believes, what a community believes, what the air of a closed institution carries, the individual bodies in that space will express. The school contacted public health authorities. Of course they did. 500 girls do not begin walking wrong in the span of weeks without attracting official attention. Investigators arrived, and they did what investigators do. They looked for the explainable, the quantifiable, the thing that would make sense in the framework they worked within. They tested the water. This is always where investigations of this kind begin. The water. It is a reasonable starting point. Contaminated water supplies can cause neurological symptoms. There are historical cases. There is precedent. The investigators tested the water at the school at Chalco, and they looked at the results, and the results said, nothing. Clean. No contamination. They tested the food. They tested the air quality. They looked for environmental toxins, heavy metals, chemical exposures, agricultural runoff from whatever was near the school. They looked for a virus, a bacterial infection, something biological moving through the population the way something biological should move, a pathogen, a vector, a transmission route that followed the rules of germ theory. They found nothing. I want to emphasize this. This was not a cursory investigation by authorities who had already made up their minds. By the time the investigation was complete, more than 500 girls and at least one teacher had exhibited symptoms. This was a documented public health event. Investigators had every incentive to find a cause that fit their frameworks. They looked hard. They tested everything they knew to test. And there was nothing. The official conclusion was mass psychogenic illness. I have sat with that conclusion for a long time. It is the correct clinical conclusion. I do not dispute it. The evidence supports it. But I want to talk about what that conclusion actually means, because I think it is often understood too quickly, as if the label ends the inquiry rather than beginning a different one. Mass psychogenic illness means the symptoms are real. That is the first thing. These girls were not pretending. Their legs were genuinely not working. If you had filmed them walking, and some footage does exist from this period, brief clips that circulated in Mexican media at the time, you would see something wrong. The gait is wrong. The body is wrong. This is not performance. Mass psychogenic illness means The cause is not organic in the conventional sense. There is no pathogen. There is no toxin. There is no lesion. The symptoms arise from the mind's interpretation of the environment, which then physically manifests in the body. Mass psychogenic illness means the spread follows social pathways rather than biological ones. You don't catch it by drinking contaminated water. You catch it, if catch is even the right word, by being in the same social environment as someone who has it, by knowing about it, by understanding yourself to be at risk. And mass psychogenic illness means the belief is the mechanism. The girls at Chalco believed they were cursed. That belief was the vector. Now I want to ask you the questions that the official conclusion does not answer, because the clinical label is accurate and also insufficient. It tells you what the mechanism is. It does not tell you why this mechanism moved the way it did. Why did the symptoms begin after Maria left? This seems like a small question. It isn't. If the condition is psychogenic, if it is generated by fear and belief and social contagion, then why didn't it begin when the board was discovered? Why didn't it begin when Maria was expelled? The moment of maximum drama, the moment of highest emotional intensity, was the discovery and the expulsion. That is when fear should have spiked. That is when the belief in something supernatural having entered the school should have been most acute. But the symptoms didn't start then. They started weeks later, after Maria had gone. As if something needed her departure to begin. As if the curse needed the cursed to leave before it could take effect. Why did the symptoms spread in clusters rather than randomly? If the vector was purely social, if knowing about the curse was enough to make you symptomatic, then you would expect the symptoms to spread in the pattern that information spreads. And information at a boarding school spreads fast and non-directionally. Everyone knows everything quickly. Yet the symptoms clustered. They moved room to room in a specific pattern, dormitory A to dormitory B to dormitory C. Not all at once, not randomly. The one teacher who was affected was in a room adjacent to Maria's former dormitory. Think about that. Of the hundreds of adults in that school, teachers, administrators, support staff, one teacher was affected, and that teacher was physically adjacent to the space Maria had occupied, the space where the board had been used, the space where the curse had been spoken. Why her, among all the adults? Why not a teacher in a classroom across the school? Why not the principal? Why the teacher who slept next to where it started? I have spent time with these questions. I have gone looking for answers that would satisfy me, that would let me close this case the way you close a case, with a neat conclusion, a mechanism fully understood, a story that ends. And I have not found those answers. I have found the clinical literature, which is thorough and valuable, and which explains the what without explaining the where and the who and the specific shape of the spreading. There are researchers who study mass psychogenic illness, historians, neurologists, sociologists, anthropologists, who have written about the conditions that produce it. Closed institutions under pressure, female adolescent populations with limited autonomy and high social density, environments where authority is absolute and transgression is punished visibly, a precipitating event that introduces the idea of contamination. And Chalco had all of those things. The school was closed and bounded. The population was female and adolescent. The authority was absolute, Catholic, institutional, enforced by teachers who could snap boards in half and expel girls without appeal. And the precipitating event was Maria, the board, the break, the curse, the departure. But the specific clustering, the specific pattern, the teacher next door. I want to tell you about what the girls' days were like as this was happening. Because when I think about those months, October 2006 through June 2007, I try to imagine the texture of ordinary life inside the school while this was spreading. These were not girls who spent every moment terrified. They still went to class. They still ate in the dining hall. They still studied and prayed and followed the schedule that told them when to do each thing. But underneath the ordinary, something was moving. I think about a girl, not Maria, not the first, one of the later ones, one of the hundreds, sitting in class, watching another girl at the front of the room struggle to stand up when the teacher called on her, watching her legs not work the way they should, watching her grab the desk for support, watching her face, the confusion, the fear, the embarrassment, and feeling something tighten in her own chest, something clarifying. She knows the story. Everyone knows the story. Maria, the board, the teacher breaking it, the curse. And now she is watching this girl's legs fail, and she is in the same school, sleeping in the same building, breathing the same air. And something shifts. Some quiet decision gets made below the level of conscious thought. Not a decision exactly, not a choice, but a recognition, a registration. Her body receiving information and beginning to process it. The doctors who came were thorough, and they were not unkind. I want to be clear about that. They were not dismissive of the girls they were examining. They ran tests. They asked questions. They listened. And when the tests came back showing nothing, they did not tell the girls they were faking. They used the language of psychogenic illness carefully, and they explained, to the school administration, to the parents, to the Mexican health officials who were monitoring the situation, what this condition is and what it is not. What it is not is fake. What it is not is simple hysteria, which is the old word, the bad word, the word that belongs to the 19th century and to the specific cruelties of that century. What it is not is girls performing for attention, or girls collectively deciding to disrupt the school year, or girls engaged in some kind of organised resistance. What it is, real symptoms arising from a real psychological process that is no less physical for being psychologically generated. But here is what I kept returning to as I researched this case. The doctors, having concluded that the illness was psychogenic, would have expected certain things to follow. Treatment, resolution, a period in which the girl's beliefs were gently and consistently addressed, in which the social environment was managed, in which the fear was gradually metabolized and the symptoms gradually resolved. That's not what happened. The symptoms did not gradually resolve. They continued through October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May. More than 500 girls total. 8 months. The institution that had declared Maria's curse to be nothing, that had punished her, expelled her, broken her board, done everything it could to assert that this was a manageable violation rather than a real event, could not stop what she had left behind. I have thought about Maria a great deal, not as a supernatural figure, not as a villain, as a teenager who was punished severely and who was angry. Who was she before the board, before the expulsion? I imagine she was someone with a specific face, specific habits, the way she sat in class, the friends she ate lunch with, the way she walked. You walk a certain way at 15 or 16 that you don't walk any other time in your life. Loose, slightly unfinished, still figuring out how much space you take up. She had been curious enough to find a board and use it. That tells you something. She was reaching for something. Whether it was genuine belief in what the board could do, or the specific electric excitement of doing something forbidden in the dark, or loneliness, or the desire to feel connected to something larger than the schedule, she was reaching. And a teacher found her in the middle of the reaching and snapped the thing she had reached for in half. And she was expelled. And she was angry. I do not know if Maria believed in what she said as she left. I don't know if she thought the curse would work. I think it doesn't matter what she believed. I think what matters is that the girls who heard her believed, and the girls who heard the story from the girls who heard her believed. And the belief was enough. The belief became the thing itself. There is a particular category of horror that I find more disturbing than anything supernatural, and it is this: the horror of what the mind can actually do. Not the horror of what we imagine might be real. The horror of what we know is real. We know that belief can generate physical symptoms. We know that shared belief, in a closed social environment, can generate those symptoms at scale. We know that the boundary between psychological and physical is not where we instinctively locate it, that the two are not separate systems, but a single system, and that disruptions in one cascade immediately into the other. We know all of this. The clinical literature documents it carefully. There are cases from factories, from schools, from churches, from military units, from entire towns. Symptoms spreading through social networks, the way light spreads through a room when someone opens a door. The body taking its cues from the collective mind. And knowing all of that, knowing the mechanism, I still cannot hear the story of Chalco without feeling something press against the back of my throat. Because knowing the mechanism doesn't diminish the event, it amplifies it. The fact that what happened at that school was psychogenic, was real in that specific, documented, neurological way, means that a teenage girl's anger was powerful enough to bring down an institution. Not because she was supernatural, because she was human. Because the girls she cursed were human. Because humans are systems that can be hacked by belief. The school year ended in June of 2007. The girls went home, and it stopped. I want to stay with this for a moment. This is the part that I cannot fully explain within any framework, clinical or otherwise. The resolution of a mass psychogenic illness typically involves intervention, therapeutic, environmental, social. You address the underlying stress. You reduce the social contagion by separating affected individuals. You treat the precipitating cause. The symptoms do not typically resolve because of a calendar date, but at Chalco, the symptom resolution tracked exactly with the school year's end. The girls went home in June, to their families, to different states, different towns, different houses. They dispersed, and the symptoms dispersed with them. No treatment, no cure, no therapeutic intervention that the records show was decisive. Just distance. Just the closed system opening up, the walls of the school becoming irrelevant, the bounded world of dormitories and crucifixes and schedules expanding into summer and home and the ordinary universe outside. I have tried to imagine what it was like to be one of those girls going home in June, to step off whatever bus or out of whatever car brought you back to your family, and to find that your legs worked. Not because a doctor had treated you, not because the curse had been lifted in any formal way, but because the place where the curse lived was no longer where you lived. Did they talk about it with their families? Did they try to explain? Did they sit at dinner tables in the summer of 2007 and attempt to put into words what those 8 months had been? The way it had spread, the way it had felt, the specific texture of being in a place where you didn't know who would wake up wrong tomorrow. Or did they do what people often do with experiences that don't fit the available language? Did they let it settle somewhere below the threshold of conversation, something to be carried rather than spoken? I think about the school itself in July of 2007, the empty dormitories, the courtyard without girls in it, the chapel with no one in the pews, the room where Maria used the board, whatever room that was, whatever specific dormitory, whatever specific bed, empty now, quiet. The teacher who was affected, she was still there, presumably. The staff did not go home for the summer the way the students did. She was still in her room adjacent to wherever Maria had been. And I wonder what she made of it, whether her own symptoms resolved with the student's departure, whether she felt the school differently when it was empty, whether she ever thought about the sequence of events that had put her in the path of this. Maria, the board, the break, the curse, the months of walking wrong. She had been the one who found Maria. She had been the one to break the board. She had enforced the rule. She had done her job. And she had been the one adult in the entire school to become symptomatic. This is a story about belief. But I want to be precise about what kind of belief I mean, because I think there are two ways to read Chalco, and one of them is too simple. The simple reading is, the girls believed in a supernatural curse. The belief made them sick. The belief was wrong, but powerful. A story about superstition. A cautionary tale about the credulity of young women in a religious institution. I do not accept that reading. Not because I think the curse was real in the supernatural sense. I do not know what I think about that, and I am going to stay in that not knowing rather than pretend certainty in either direction. I do not accept it because it locates the power in the wrong place. The power was not in the superstition. The power was in the reality of what the school was, the specific social and psychological conditions it created, the containment, the hierarchy, the absolute authority, the isolation. The fact that these girls had no outside world to buffer what was happening inside those walls. The fact that Maria's expulsion was visible and absolute and left no room for ambiguity about what the institution thought of her or of what she had done. She cursed them on her way out. And the curse worked not because the curse was real in any mystical sense, but because the school was real in its specific way. A closed system under pressure, primed for exactly this kind of cascade. The belief was the mechanism, but the institution created the belief. I have seen the film announcement. Blumhouse has optioned the story. There will be a movie called Our Lady of Tears, based on what happened at Chalco. And I understand why it appeals to horror filmmakers. It has everything the genre wants. A Catholic institution, a forbidden object, a curse, bodies failing, the spread. But I want to say something about the difference between the story as it happened and the story as it will be filmed. The horror of the real event is not in the supernatural elements. The horror of the real event is in the precision. It is in the specific number. 500 and something girls, not a round number, not a story number, but a count. It is in the one teacher, next door. It is in the 8 months of the school year and the resolution that came not from treatment, but from summer. It is in Maria being a teenager with a board who was curious and punished and angry. Film horror requires a monster. The horror at Chalco did not have a monster. It had a social structure. It had a belief system. It had a closed space and a population under pressure, and a girl who was expelled and said words on her way out the door. That is harder to film. That is also harder to shake. I go back, in my mind, to a specific image. I do not know if this image is from actual footage, or if I have constructed it from the descriptions I've read. By this point in my research, the two are sometimes difficult to separate. But the image is of a girl in a school corridor, walking, or trying to walk. One foot not lifting the way it should. The drag. The effort of it visible in her whole body. The way the hip compensates. The way the shoulders tighten. She is not a character in a horror film. She is a student at a school in Chalco, trying to get from one classroom to another, and her legs are not cooperating, and she doesn't know why. And the girls around her have seen this before because they have seen it happen to someone else. And some of them are scared because they don't know if it will happen to them next. And some of them are scared because it already has. And the school continues around this. The bells, the schedule, the classes, the dining hall, the chapel, the prayers. Because institutions continue. That's the image I come back to. Not the board, not the curse. The girl in the corridor trying to walk. There are things I wanted to find out about this case that I could not find out. I wanted to talk to one of the girls, one of the 500, now adults in their 30s, living lives somewhere in Mexico. I wanted to ask what she remembered. Not what happened to her body, but what she remembers thinking, what she remembers feeling, whether she can identify the moment when the fear arrived and became something physical. I could not find that person. The case passed through Mexican local press in 2006 and 2007 and attracted some international attention when researchers began writing about it in the context of mass psychogenic illness. But the individual girls, their identities, their subsequent lives, I cannot reach them. They went home in June of 2007 and they became private people. And the story became something that happened to them rather than something they were still inside of. I hope that's true. I hope they are private. I hope the distance of almost 20 years has done what the distance of summer 2007 did, that it has opened the closed space up, let light and ordinary time in, made whatever it was that moved through their school a memory rather than a presence. But I think about Maria too. What did the summer of 2007 look like for her? She had been expelled months before the worst of it hit. She was gone before the doctors came, before the news coverage, before the clinical conclusions. She was somewhere else, at another school, or at home, or in whatever life the expulsion had pushed her toward, when 500 girls could not walk. Did she know? Did news of it reach her? Did she feel something specific when she heard what was happening, if she heard what was happening? Did she believe she had done it? I have no answer to that. I have no way of knowing what Maria believed, then or after. I have only the account of what she said as she left, and the account of what followed, and the 8 months between. What I know is this. She was expelled from a Catholic boarding school for using a Ouija board after lights out. She was 16, or 15, or 17, something in that range. She was punished absolutely by an institution with absolute authority. She said words on her way out, and then 500 people could not walk for 8 months. Whether you explain that through mass psychogenic illness or through something else, whether you locate the cause in the social structure of the school or in the specific words Maria said, or in something that the board contacted that night in the dark, you are still left with the same residue, a teenager's anger, an institution, 8 months, 500 bodies. The school is still there. The institution, or something that operates in that space, continues. Students attend it. Teachers teach in it. The chapel still has a schedule. The dormitories still have lights out. And somewhere in the building, there is a room that was adjacent to Maria's dormitory. There is a teacher's room next door to where the board was used. The walls have not changed. The geography has not changed. Whatever happened in that space, whatever the room experienced in October of 2006, when a girl asked questions in the dark, and a teacher opened the door, and an institution responded with its full force, that space is still there. I don't know what I believe about space and memory, and whether rooms hold things. I genuinely don't know. I have been to places that felt heavy, and places that felt light, and I cannot tell you if that is perception or something else. But I know that I think about that room. I know that if I were in that school, I would be aware of it. I know that its specific adjacency, Maria's dormitory here, the teacher's room here, just a wall between them, would be in the back of my mind wherever I walked in that building. There is a detail I return to about the breaking of the board. The teacher snapped it in half. 2 pieces. I don't know what happened to those pieces. Maybe they were thrown away. Maybe they were burned, which is the tradition. You burn it, you don't just throw it away, because throwing it away isn't decisive enough, because it leaves it in the world in a form that can be retrieved, or that can exert whatever it is you fear it might exert. Maybe the teacher threw them in a trash can, and they went to a landfill with everything else. But maybe not. And I think about the 2 pieces of the board, the specific clean break, the way wood or cardboard breaks when you apply force to it, the sound it would have made in that dormitory room while Maria watched. The teacher meant it as an act of ending. This is over, this is broken, this cannot function in 2 pieces the way it functioned as one. And then Maria left, and 500 people couldn't walk. I want to say something about the girls who were last, the ones who became symptomatic in May, a month before the school year ended. By May, the case had been in the news. The official conclusion, mass psychogenic illness, had been circulating. The girls at the school knew that doctors had come and found nothing, that the official position was that this was a stress-induced, psychologically transmitted condition, and still it spread. Still the last girl, in May, began walking wrong. What does that mean? It means that the knowledge of the mechanism was not enough to prevent the mechanism from working. The girls knew they were not organically sick. Some of them probably knew about mass psychogenic illness, about the way belief can transmit symptoms. And that knowledge was not protective. It was not enough to break the social contagion. The closed world of the school was more powerful than the clinical explanation. The belief was the reality. The reality was the belief. June came. The year ended. The girls packed their dormitories and got on buses and went home. I think about that departure, not as something triumphant, the girls escaping, the school releasing them, the curse finally broken. I think about it as quieter than that. The ordinary logistics of the end of a school year, the labelling of bags, the making sure you have your things, the goodbyes that are complicated by the fact that you have spent 8 months in this specific shared experience and there is not yet language for what it has been. And then the bus, and then home, and the legs worked. Whatever had been in that closed space, whether it was psychogenic contagion, whether it was the specific gravity of shared belief, whether it was something that the board had introduced into the air of that dormitory on an October night and that had moved through the school like weather. Whatever it was, it needed the school to be the school. It needed the walls. It needed the schedule and the chapel and the dining hall and the dormitories with their lights-out rule and their hierarchy and their absolute authority. Outside those walls, it didn't travel. Outside those walls, the girls' legs worked. There is a version of this story that is about the supernatural. Maria contacted something. Something came through. Something spread. There is a version that is entirely clinical. Mass psychogenic illness, stress vector, social contagion, resolution upon environmental change. I don't know which version I believe, and I have stopped trying to choose. What I know is that both versions end in the same place. A school, 8 months, 500 girls who could not walk. A teenage girl's departure as the precipitating event. The specific clustering that followed social geography more than random transmission. The one teacher next door. The summer ending it without treatment. Both versions of the story leave you in the same room. The room where Maria used the board. Late October, after lights out. Whatever it was she was doing in that dark, whether she believed in it, whether she was performing for friends, whether she was reaching for something and something reached back. She was there. 15 or 16 or 17 years old, in the dark, with a board and a question, and the specific quiet of a boarding school at night, which is not quite quiet at all, but layered. The breathing of other girls, the distant sound of the institution's infrastructure, the particular acoustic quality of a dormitory. She asked something. The planchette moved, or didn't move. A teacher opened the door, and then everything that followed. I began this the way I begin everything, at a distance, in research, looking at documents and clinical papers and news accounts. I have spent time with this case that I cannot fully account for. Hours that have spread into something longer. I have read everything I can find about Chalco. I have read everything I can find about mass psychogenic illness. I have tried to locate interviews with the girls, or the teacher, or school administrators that might give me the texture of the thing from inside. And what I have found is the outlines, the number, the dates, the clinical conclusion, the unanswered questions about the pattern. What I haven't found is the inside of it, what it felt like to be there, what it felt like to be one of the last girls to go down, to watch it spread for months, to know the story, to have the clinical explanation, to think, maybe I won't be one of them, maybe I'll make it to June, and then to feel your legs fail. That interior experience is not in any document I have found. It is in the girls themselves, in their 30s now, wherever they are. If any of them are watching this, and they might be, it's a strange world. Information travels in strange patterns. I want to say something directly. Not the something that a horror narrator usually says. Not the stay safe or the lock your doors or the typical closing. What I want to say is, I believe you. Whatever you experienced in that school, whatever it was, clinical or otherwise, I believe you experienced it. I believe the legs not working was real. I believe the fear was real. I believe that whatever moved through your school from October to June was real in whatever sense it was real. And I believe it stopped. I believe you went home and it stopped. The school at Chalco, the city of girls, 500 girls who could not walk, a board broken in 2 pieces, a teenager's curse at the gate, 8 months and then summer and then silence. No treatment, no cure. Just the walls becoming irrelevant, just the closed world opening, just distance doing what medicine could not. There is a Blumhouse film coming. There will be a version of this story with a monster and a climax and a resolution that costs something. A final confrontation, a price paid, an explanation that satisfies the genre. I will watch it. I will probably find it effective. Horror film craft is real craft, and I respect it. But after I watch it, I will come back to this, to the real Chalco, to the number that stopped me when I first saw it, to the questions that the clinical conclusion answers and the questions it doesn't, to Maria, who was just a girl with a board in the dark, to 500 girls who could not walk, to the summer that ended it without explaining it. That's the case. That's what I know. Sleep well. 4 jurors smuggled a board into the hotel room. The next morning, they convicted a man for double murder. There's a case file on my screen right now, and I've been staring at it for 3 hours. I should have closed the laptop at midnight. I had other things to do. I had a reasonable night ahead of me. But I made the mistake of clicking on a court document from England, 1994, and now it's somewhere past 2 in the morning, and I am sitting here in the dark trying to understand what I'm reading. Because what I'm reading doesn't fit neatly into any category I know how to use. It isn't quite a murder story. It isn't quite a paranormal story. It's something that exists in the space between those two things, and the fact that it exists in that space is, I think, the most disturbing thing about it. Let me tell you what I found. Wadhurst is a village in East Sussex, England. It sits in what the English call the High Weald, that stretch of ancient woodland and rolling hills between the North and South Downs. It's the kind of place that looks like a painting of England rather than England itself. Sandstone church from the 13th century, half-timbered houses along the high street, footpaths cutting through woodland that's been there since before anyone was keeping records. The kind of village where people move because they want something quieter, something safer, something that feels like it belongs to an older, gentler world. Harry Fuller moved there because of exactly that. He was 45 years old in 1993, a car salesman who had spent his working life in the noise and pressure of dealerships, closing sales, managing customers, the relentless performance of it. He had reached the point in his life where he wanted the opposite of all that. He had bought a cottage, and when I say cottage, I want you to understand the specific quality of what that word means in this context, in this part of England. A low stone building with old casement windows and a garden, and the particular silence of a place that is genuinely far from the noise of the city. He had moved there with his wife Nicola. Nicola was 27, 18 years younger than Harry. I mention that not to editorialise, but because details matter in this kind of case, and that detail will matter later. She was young, and the marriage was relatively new, and by all accounts she was building a life in that village, finding her footing, making it home. They knew Stephen Young. I want to be careful here, because Stephen Young is a man who has been convicted twice of murder, and I'm not in the business of relitigating verdicts. But I also want to be honest with you about what this case is, and what it requires me to say, and so I'll say it plainly. I don't know whether Stephen Young killed Harry and Nicola Fuller. I know what 2 juries concluded. I know what the Court of Appeals concluded. I know what Young himself maintains. And I know what a Ouija board spelled out at midnight in a hotel room in East Sussex after 4 drunk jurors had decided to ask it. I know all of those things. And I still don't know what to do with them. Stephen Young was a financial advisor. That's the professional description. What it means practically is that he was the kind of man who sat with people during the most vulnerable financial moments of their lives, when they were planning for retirement, when they were managing an inheritance, when they were trying to figure out what the future looked like. He was someone Harry and Nicola trusted with that kind of vulnerability. He was a friend. The night of June 24th, 1993. I've looked at the timeline until I can recite it in order, and the order of it matters, the sequence of it matters, because what happened in that cottage happened in a specific sequence that tells you something about who did it, and why, and with what kind of intention. Harry and Nicola were home. The cottage was quiet. There was no forced entry. I want to stay with that for a moment, because it's the detail that changes the shape of everything else. No forced entry. No broken window. No kicked-in door. No sign that anyone came in from the outside against the resistance of the locks or the will of the people inside. Which means whoever came in that night either had a key or was let in. Which means whoever came in that night was not a stranger. Harry was shot first. The specifics of what the forensic evidence told investigators, the positioning, the angle, the nature of the wounds, these things indicated that he was targeted with deliberate precision. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not an interrupted burglary where someone panicked. The shooting of Harry Fuller was intentional and methodical. And then Nicola. Nicola was shot 4 times. I've read that sentence in court documents and news archives and legal summaries, and each time I read it, I stop for a moment and try to let it mean what it means. 4 times. The forensic reconstruction of what happened in that cottage suggested that at some point during what was happening, Nicola Fuller, 27 years old, trying to understand what was happening in her home, reached for the phone. Reached for the phone to call for help. And the 4th bullet came then. The 4th bullet came as she was reaching for the phone. I need you to sit with that for a moment. Not because I'm trying to be theatrical about it, I'm not. But because that detail, the 4th bullet, the phone, the reaching, tells you something specific and terrible about the person who was in that cottage that night. Whoever was there saw her reach for that phone, saw her try to get help, and made a decision, made a choice in that moment, in that specific moment, to prevent that from happening. That's not panic. That's not accident. That's intent carried through to its conclusion. The cottage in Wadhurst was quiet again. The village outside was quiet. The High Weald was dark and old and indifferent, the way landscape always is, the way it was before Harry and Nicola moved there, and will be long after everyone who knew them is also gone. And somewhere in the dark, someone left. The investigation moved the way investigations move. Witnesses were interviewed. Evidence was collected and analysed. The financial relationship between the Fullers and Stephen Young came under scrutiny. I won't reconstruct the full evidentiary case here because that's not quite what this story is about. The story is about what happened later, in the hotel room, in the dark, with 4 jurors and a board, and a question that none of them should have been asking. But I want you to understand that by the time Stephen Young was charged with the double murder of Harry and Nicola Fuller, there was a case. There was evidence. There were things that pointed toward him, and things he said and did in the aftermath that investigators found significant. He was charged. He denied it. And in 1994, the matter went to trial. I want to tell you about what it means for a murder trial to happen in England. I don't mean the legal mechanics of it. I mean the human weight of it. The courtroom is a particular kind of space. It has a particular architecture, both physically and psychologically, designed to do a specific thing. To take the enormity of what happened and subject it to reason. To process it through logic and evidence and testimony. To take the chaos and violence of 2 people being shot in their cottage in a quiet English village and turn it into something a group of ordinary citizens can deliberate about and reach a conclusion. That's the theory of a trial. That's what it's supposed to do. 12 ordinary people, Stephen Young in the dock, the prosecution laying out its case, the defence contesting it, witnesses, evidence, arguments. the whole elaborate machinery of English justice grinding forward, trying to get to the truth of what happened in that cottage on June 24th, 1993. The jurors were housed in a hotel. This is standard practice in high-profile cases. Jurors are sequestered to prevent them from being influenced by outside information, by press coverage, by people who might try to interfere with their deliberations. The hotel is meant to be a controlled environment, neutral, sealed off from the noise and pressure of the outside world. It was not sealed off from alcohol. I don't know exactly how the drinking started that evening. Court documents describe it as a night of heavy drinking, which is a phrase that tells you the conclusion without fully conveying the texture of how you get there. These were ordinary people. They had been sitting in a courtroom for days, listening to the details of how Harry and Nicola Fuller were shot in their cottage, looking at crime scene photographs, weighing testimony, doing the particular and exhausting work of trying to be fair and rational about something that is neither fair nor rational. Murder is not a rational event. It doesn't respond well to rational processing. And these 12 people had been trying to process it rationally for days. So they drank. Some of them drank more than others. By later accounts, by what eventually emerged when this story became what it became, 4 of them were in a particular condition by a particular point in the evening. 4 of them had decided to try something. I want to tell you about Ouija boards, not in the way that you might be expecting me to, not with dramatic build-up or ominous music swelling underneath, but plainly and honestly, because I think that's the only way to actually talk about what happened in that hotel room. A Ouija board, or spirit board, or talking board, depending on who you ask and what tradition you're drawing from, is at its most basic level a flat surface printed with letters and numbers and the words yes and no, used in conjunction with a small movable piece called a planchette. The idea is that you put your fingers on the planchette, ask a question, and the planchette moves to spell out an answer. The scientific explanation for this, and there is a scientific explanation, which is important, is something called the ideomotor effect. Your muscles make small, involuntary movements so subtle that you're not consciously aware of making them, and those movements nudge the planchette, and because multiple people are doing this simultaneously, the nudges accumulate and direct, and the planchette moves to letters and spells things out. The things it spells out come from the unconscious minds of the people with their fingers on it, their fears, their hopes, their beliefs about what the answer is, all of it translating into tiny muscle movements that they don't know they're making. That is the scientific explanation, and it is, I think, probably correct. Probably. What the scientific explanation cannot fully account for is what happens when 4 drunk jurors in a hotel room in East Sussex, England, in 1994, ask a Ouija board who killed Harry and Nicola Fuller, and it answers them. I need you to understand the specificity of the location. This wasn't some anonymous hotel in a city. This was East Sussex. The same county, the same landscape, the same stretch of high weald where Wadhurst sits and where the cottage was and where the murders happened. They were, in a very real sense, geographically close to where it all went wrong. The same sky above them, the same dark landscape outside whatever window the hotel room had, the same particular quality of English rural night that, if you've ever been in it, you know has a specific weight to it, a specific oldness. They had been drinking. It was late. Accounts suggest this was happening in the middle hours of the night, the kind of time where your judgment is impaired not just by alcohol, but by exhaustion and the particular loosening of inhibitions that happens when the rest of the world seems to be asleep and you and the people around you are the only ones awake. The only ones in this particular pocket of consciousness. Someone produced a board. I don't know who. I don't know if they brought it with them premeditated, or found it somewhere, or improvised with a handwritten arrangement of letters. Court documents are not always generous with the granular details of exactly how 4 drunk jurors decided to do this particular thing. But they did it. They made a board, or brought a board, or used a board. And they sat down together, and they put their fingers on the planchette. And they asked, who killed Harry and Nicola Fuller? Let me tell you what it would have been like in that room. the specific quality of the air. Hotel rooms have a particular air, sealed and slightly stale, the kind of temperature that's artificially maintained. A lamp on somewhere, probably, because this was a hotel room, and hotel rooms don't have the kind of darkness you get in genuinely dark places, but a reduced light, the kind that makes faces look different than they do in full daylight. 4 people around a surface, their hands on a planchette or on a glass. I've seen both described in different accounts. And the silence of people who are doing something they half believe in and half don't, and are somehow doing anyway. The question hangs in the room. Who killed Harry and Nicola Fuller? And the planchette begins to move. S. A letter. Just a letter. The planchette moving slowly to the S. 4 sets of fingers riding it, not pushing, not guiding, or not consciously guiding, which is either the same thing or completely different, depending on what you believe about what was happening in that room. S. T. The planchette moving again. T. 2 letters now. 2 letters that could be a name or could be nothing, could be the beginning of anything. E. 3 letters. S-T-E. And here, I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine, here something changes in the room. Because 3 letters is getting specific. 3 letters is starting to narrow the field. 3 letters might be suggesting something. S-T-E-P, step. H, Steph. E, Steph. N, Stephen. They had the first name. The planchette resting briefly on N and then beginning to move again. Because it wasn't done. Because there was more to spell. And these 4 people, drunk, exhausted, sitting in a hotel room in the dark, supposedly sealed away from outside influence by the very fact of their sequestration, were watching a piece of wood or glass move under their own fingers and spell out a name that they all recognized. A name that had been central to the trial they had been sitting in. A name that was unavoidable. Yoon, Stephen Young. And then, because this is the part that takes a moment to fully land, the board wasn't finished. The board had more to say. Done it. Done it. Not did it, done it. A particular English idiom, a specific phrase. Stephen Young, done it. And then, because even that wasn't enough, Fujal Tamora. Vote guilty tomorrow. I want you to sit with that sentence, not for dramatic effect. I mean, literally, I want you to sit with the full weight of what that sentence means in context. A board is spelling out, is allegedly being moved by the unconscious fingers of 4 drunk people, or by something else, by whatever you believe in or don't believe in, spelling out specific instructions to members of a jury about how to vote on a murder conviction the following day. Vote guilty tomorrow. The instructions were clear. The name was specific. The command was direct. And in the morning, in the specific ordinary morning that followed that specific extraordinary night, the jury filed back into the courtroom. They took their seats in the jury box, the 12 of them, the 4 who had been in that hotel room and the 8 who had not. 12 ordinary people trying to do an extraordinary thing, which is to determine the truth of whether a man they'd been looking at for weeks had shot 2 people in a cottage in Wadhurst. They deliberated. The deliberations proceeded as deliberations are supposed to proceed. Discussion, argument, the weighing of evidence, the process of arriving at a consensus. I don't know what was said in that jury room. I don't know how much weight the previous night carried in the minds of the 4 who had been there. I don't know whether they walked into those deliberations intending to vote a particular way, intending to honour or disregard what they'd been told by the board in the middle of the night. Human beings are complicated, and drunk experiences have a different quality in the sober morning, and it's possible that those 4 people went into the jury room intending to approach the question freshly and fairly. It's possible. The jury convicted Stephen Young of the double murder of Harry and Nicola Fuller. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The case closed. The verdict stood. Harry and Nicola's families had a conviction. Stephen Young went to prison. The machine of justice had done the thing it was designed to do. It had taken the chaos of a violent crime and subjected it to reason, and produced a verdict. And then, someone talked. I don't know who. I've looked, and I can find accounts of what was revealed, but not a clear accounting of exactly how it first emerged. But at some point after the conviction, information about what had happened in that hotel room began to surface. One of the 4 jurors, or someone who'd heard from one of them, or some process of confession or conscience that I can't fully reconstruct, the information made it out. 4 jurors, a board, a session in the middle of the night, the board spelling out the defendant's name, the verdict the following morning. The story reached the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal of England and Wales is an old institution with a specific function: to review convictions and determine whether they were obtained fairly and legally. It is, in its way, the safeguard, the mechanism that exists precisely for situations where something went wrong in a trial, where the machinery malfunctioned, where the verdict was reached by a process that cannot be allowed to stand. The court heard the case, and the court reached a conclusion that is, in legal terms, absolutely clear, and in every other sense, profoundly strange. The conviction was quashed. A murder conviction, 2 counts of murder, life imprisonment, was set aside. Not because new evidence had emerged that pointed to someone else, not because the prosecution had committed misconduct, not because witnesses had recanted. The conviction was quashed because 4 members of the jury had asked a Ouija board who did it, and the Ouija board had told them, and they had voted accordingly. The legal reasoning here is worth understanding, because it matters and because it's surprisingly straightforward. The right to trial by jury, in England as in most countries that derive their legal traditions from English common law, is not simply a right to have 12 people in a room. It is a right to have those 12 people deliberate, to use their reason, to weigh the evidence as it was presented in the courtroom, under the rules of evidence, in accordance with the directions of the judge. The jury system rests on a specific assumption, that the verdict is the product of rational deliberation by human beings, applying human judgment to the evidence before them. If the verdict is instead the product of a Ouija board session at midnight in a hotel room, if the deliberative process has been contaminated by something that is, by definition, not rational deliberation, then the verdict cannot stand. Not because the Ouija board was necessarily wrong, but because the process by which it was reached has been fatally compromised. The law doesn't ask whether the board was right. The law asks whether the process was fair. And the process was not fair, so the conviction was quashed. Stephen Young was released from his original conviction, and then he was retried. A completely different jury, 12 different people, no connection to the first trial, no knowledge of what had happened in the hotel room, no knowledge of the board or the session or the letters it had spelled out. Just 12 people who had heard the evidence and were now being asked to do the thing juries are asked to do. The second jury convicted Stephen Young of the double murder of Harry and Nicola Fuller. He is currently serving life. I have been staring at that sequence of events, the first conviction, the appeal, the retrial, the second conviction, for 3 hours now, and I keep arriving at the same place, which is a place I don't entirely know how to describe. It's not quite certainty. It's not quite confusion. It's something between those two things, something that sits in the chest like a weight that won't settle in any particular direction. Let me tell you what the sequence means, or what it might mean, depending on which way you look at it. If Stephen Young is guilty, if the 2 independent juries that convicted him are both right, if the evidence points where it appears to point, then what happened in that hotel room is almost cosmically strange. 4 drunk people asked a board who did it, and the board named the man who did it. The board was right. Something moved through those 4 sets of hands in the dark, whether it was their own unconscious knowledge, their own sense of where the evidence pointed, or something else, something that doesn't fit into the scientific explanation as cleanly as we'd like. And it named the right person. And I want you to think about what it would mean if that's true. Not in a comfortable, abstract way. I mean, really think about it. The dead couple in the cottage, Harry, who was 45 and had moved to this quiet village to have a quieter life, and Nicola, who was 27 and reaching for the phone as the fourth bullet came. What if something of them, or something connected to them, or something that had witnessed what happened in that cottage on June 24th, 1993, was still present in the atmosphere of East Sussex a year later? What if it found its way into a hotel room where 4 drunk people were asking exactly the right question? What if it answered? That is one possibility. And I don't say it lightly, and I don't say it to be dramatic, and I don't expect you to accept it as fact. But I want to name it clearly because I think refusing to name it would be a kind of intellectual dishonesty about what this case actually raises. The other possibility, and this is the one that keeps me up, the one that has me here at 2 a.m. instead of asleep, the one that lives in the marrow of this case, is different. What if the board was wrong? The idiomotor effect is real. It's been demonstrated in controlled studies. The unconscious mind moves the hand moves the planchette spells out what the unconscious mind already believes. And what did those 4 jurors believe? What did they already know, sitting in that hotel room, before they ever set their fingers on the board? They had been sitting in a courtroom for days, listening to a prosecution case against Stephen Young. They had heard the prosecution's evidence. They had heard the prosecution's narrative. And even if they consciously intended to remain neutral, even if they were genuinely trying to reserve judgment, the unconscious mind doesn't always comply with conscious intentions. What if those 4 jurors had already, before that evening, before that hotel room, before the board, what if they had already formed a belief? What if the board spelled out Stephen Young, because somewhere in the unconscious minds of the people touching it, Stephen Young was already the answer? And what if they were wrong? The second jury convicted him. I know that. 2 independent juries reached the same conclusion. The weight of that is not nothing. I'm not dismissing it. But I'm also asking you to think carefully about what it means that the first conviction was reached through a process that included 4 jurors asking a board who to convict, and then to think about whether the contamination of that process ends cleanly at the legal boundary the Court of Appeal drew. The second jury didn't know about the board. That's true, but the first jury's conviction is not the only thing that preceded the second trial. There was a public record. There was a known case. There was the entire apparatus of a retrial, which by its nature carries within it the gravity of the original proceedings. The second jury deliberated independently, yes, but they deliberated in a context that had already been shaped by what came before. I'm not saying the second jury was wrong. I'm not saying Stephen Young is innocent. I don't know either of those things. I'm saying that once you know what happened in that hotel room, once you know that 4 drunk jurors asked a Ouija board whether to convict a man and the board told them to, you can't unknow it. It becomes part of the texture of the case. It becomes the thing that sits underneath everything else and raises a question that the law, having done what the law can do, cannot fully answer. The law said the process was contaminated. The law said, do it again, properly. The law did what it could do. But the question the law cannot answer is, what was in that room? Let me tell you the thing that I keep coming back to. The thing that I keep circling in this case. The way you circle a particular idea when you can't quite land on it, but can't quite let it go either. The board was specific. I've read about Ouija board sessions that went wrong, that produced gibberish, that produced contradictory answers, that named multiple people, that said things that made no sense or couldn't be verified. The history of people asking Ouija boards about specific real-world events and getting specific answers is a history full of noise and confusion and ambiguity. This board was not ambiguous. The board spelled a full name. First name, last name, completely correct. The board attached a phrase, done it, that reads like a human voice, like a specific kind of English speech pattern, the kind of casual phrasing someone might use if they were describing something that actually happened. The board issued specific instructions, vote guilty tomorrow, that were temporally precise, that acknowledged the context of what was happening, that seemed aware of the specific situation of the people asking. That level of specificity is either the product of 4 unconscious minds all converging on the same belief they'd formed from the evidence, or it's something else. I can't tell you which one it is. I want to be honest with you about that. I've been sitting with this case for 3 hours, and I genuinely cannot tell you which explanation I believe. Both of them are disturbing, in different ways. If the unconscious convergence explanation is right, then what the board session reveals is the fallibility of human judgment and the contamination of supposedly rational processes by the very unconscious biases and preformed conclusions that the trial system is designed to prevent. It reveals that 4 people who were supposed to hold their judgment in suspension until deliberations were complete had already decided. That they decided to drink away the strain of the decision and found their decision waiting for them in the movements of their own hands. If the other explanation is right, if something new, if something answered, then the implications extend into territory I'm not entirely sure how to map. Because if something could know, and could communicate that knowledge through the unconscious movements of 4 drunk people in a hotel room, then what is the nature of that knowledge? Where does it come from? What is it? And why does it care? Why would whatever exists in that space beyond what we understand care about the outcome of a murder trial in East Sussex? Why would it insert itself into the legal machinery of human justice? Why those 4 jurors? Why that night? Why that board? Harry and Nicola Fuller are dead. They were shot in their cottage in Wadhurst on June 24, 1993. Harry was 45 and had moved to a quiet village to have a quieter life. And instead, he died in that quiet village, and the quiet was a different kind of quiet after that. Nicola was 27 and reaching for the phone, trying to call for help, and the help didn't come in time, and then a bullet came instead. If there is something beyond this, if there is some dimension in which what happened to Harry and Nicola Fuller left a mark on the world that persisted past their deaths, then I think I understand why it would try to speak. I think I understand the motivation. I don't know what I believe about whether such things are possible, but I understand the motivation. The question is whether it did. I've been trying to find, in the hours I've spent with this case, some piece of evidence that would answer it definitively. Some fact that would tell me clearly the board was wrong and Young was innocent, or the board was right and something beyond human understanding inserted itself into a murder trial. I haven't found that piece of evidence. I don't think it exists. What exists instead is this: a verdict quashed by the Court of Appeal on the grounds that 4 jurors consulted a Ouija board. A second jury that, knowing nothing about that session, reached the same conclusion. Stephen Young, currently serving life for the murders of Harry and Nicola Fuller. And 4 people who sat in a hotel room in East Sussex in 1994, drunk and exhausted, and probably not thinking very clearly about what they were doing, who put their fingers on a piece of something and asked a question and got an answer, and then voted. I want to tell you one more thing before I close this. The letters. The sequence of letters. Stephen Young done it. Vote guilty tomorrow. Imagine you are one of the 4. Imagine you are sitting in that hotel room, your fingers light on the planchette, a question in the air that you've been carrying for days. A question that has been eating at you in the way these questions eat at people who are trying to be fair about something unfair. You asked, and the planchette started moving, and you watched it move to S. You didn't know what it was spelling yet. S is just S. S could be anything, and you told yourself that. You watched it move to T, and you told yourself that ST is just ST. That could be anything. And then E, and then P, and then H, and then E, and then N. And somewhere around the 5th or 6th letter, you started to know what was coming. Some part of you started to assemble the name, even as the planchette was still moving, even as you were still telling yourself you didn't know, even as you were trying to maintain the fiction that your fingers were passive and not participating. And then, Young. And I want to know, I genuinely want to know, in the way that this kind of case makes you want to know things you can never actually know, what that felt like. Whether it felt like revelation. whether it felt like confirmation, whether it felt like the quiet, appalling sensation of something you already knew being said out loud by a source you hadn't expected, whether it felt like something from outside reaching in, or whether it felt like nothing, whether it felt like exactly what the science says it is, your own hands spelling out your own belief, whether you could tell the difference. The village of Wadhurst is still there, the sandstone church from the 13th century, the half-timbered houses on the high street, the footpaths cutting through the high weald. The cottage where Harry and Nicola Fuller lived and where they died is still there, presumably. Properties don't disappear because of what happened in them. Life goes on around these places. The landscape continues. But there's a hotel room somewhere in East Sussex where 4 people sat down with a board and asked a question. And the board answered. And the answer named a man. And that man was convicted by 2 separate juries for the murders of Harry and Nicola Fuller. And somewhere in the gap between all of those things, the murders and the session and the verdict and the appeal and the retrial and the second verdict, there is a question that I cannot answer, and that no court has answered, and that the law by its nature cannot answer. Was it right? Whatever spoke through those hands in the dark, was it right? I'm going to close the laptop now. The case file is still on the screen. The court documents, the newspaper reports, the legal summaries, and I'm going to close it. I'm going to try to sleep, which I think will take some time. There's a particular kind of unease that comes from spending time with a case like this, a specific quality of unsettlement that isn't quite fear and isn't quite grief, but is something adjacent to both. Because the worst version of this story, the version I keep coming back to, the version that lives underneath all the other versions, isn't the one where something supernatural spoke through 4 drunk people's hands and named the right man. That version is disturbing, yes. That version raises questions about the nature of death and consciousness, and what persists, and what can reach back through the veil. But it is, in its way, a version with a kind of strange justice to it. The worst version is the one where the board was wrong, where those 4 people, drunk and exhausted and contaminated by days of prosecution narrative, spelled out the name that was already in their heads, where their unconscious biases moved the planchette to a conclusion they had already reached, dressed it up as something outside themselves, gave it the authority of the supernatural, so they could walk into that jury room the next morning and vote with conviction. Where the session in the hotel room didn't reveal the truth so much as it laundered a prejudgment, turned a human failure, the failure of 4 jurors to maintain impartiality, into a verdict that sent a man to prison. And where the second jury, seeing the same evidence, reached the same conclusion, not because the evidence was overwhelming and definitive, but because sometimes 2 juries are both wrong in the same direction, because the same errors in human reasoning can replicate, because the unconscious mind that moved those hands might have been reflecting something real, or might have been reflecting a mistake, and the mistake might have been persuasive enough to look like truth twice. I don't know which version is true. That's the honest end of this. I know Harry Fuller was shot in his cottage in Wadhurst, East Sussex, on June 24, 1993. I know Nicola Fuller was shot 4 times, the last time as she was reaching for the phone. I know the cottage had no forced entry. I know Stephen Young was charged and tried and convicted and appealed and retried and convicted again. I know 4 jurors sat in a hotel room in the dark with a board and asked a question. I know what the board said. And I know that 30 years later, in the middle of the night, a person can come across the court documents for this case and sit with them for 3 hours and still not know whether what happened in that hotel room was the most bizarre coincidence in the history of English criminal justice, or whether something knew what happened in that cottage and found a way, through the imperfect and compromised and inebriated medium of 4 human beings and a piece of board, to say so. I know that both possibilities are, in their different ways, terrifying. The board spelled Vote guilty tomorrow. And they did. And Harry and Nicola are still dead, and Stephen Young is still in prison, and the cottage in Wadhurst is still there, and 4 people who were in a hotel room one night in 1994 have to live with what happened there, and what they did there, and what moved through their hands in the dark, whatever it was. Rook out. Both stories end in the same uncomfortable place. Maybe the board was only human hands. Maybe the curse was only belief. And maybe those words do not make either case safer. A verdict moved. A school changed. Bodies answered. Carry that carefully tonight. Which would scare you more to live with? A board naming the right man? Or 500 girls getting sick because everyone believed they would?